You know, I think I really love camping. I think it's really important. I think that camping makes you, I think it makes you start to negotiate inside and outside environments in a really important way. And camping in the financial district is really weird, and it's really fun. And to be able to do that, well, it made me, you know, the time I spent at Zuccotti Park, I was really angry all the time. I was really angry, but I wasn't necessarily like more angry than I had been before. It just was a means to articulate that anger. But, you know, after you spent time at Occupy, the rest of the city started to look different. It started to look more foreign. And I think that's really important. I think that being at Occupy helped me articulate the political as a space with a lot of different forces at play. It helped me look at everything differently. Like, I started noticing the advertisements on the subway in a certain way. I started noticing the police barricades. I started noticing all of these different forces at play in the city that are determining where you walk and where you don't walk, what you imagine is possible and what you're not allowed to imagine. But it also made me question the means by which we are trying to achieve this democracy. At Zuccotti Park, I realized that the very few people there were looking closely. Like, nobody was questioning, like, why does this park look like a prison? Or just because we have the right to express ourselves, does that mean that we have the freedom to be heard? Or where does this fight take place? Is it on the streets or is it somewhere else? And is delegating power to the majority really a good idea in the long run? But I guess to go back to talk about political possibility, I think if anything, Occupy was a rupture. It was the result of pressure building up under a membrane, and it closed up very quickly, but that energy is still there, and there will be other ruptures in different forms. I think we do have to take into account counter-revolution, a counter-revolution that has been going on for decades, where the role of the state becomes the management of a potential crisis. And I think that if Occupy, or whatever it turns into, is going to succeed or come close to anything that we could call success, then it's going to have to move very quickly. It's going to have to take different forms. It's going to have to become aware of its environment in a way that it wasn't before.
I approached Occupy Wall Street extremely optimistically. I had recently gotten back from Nepal, and I was kind of into Mao and Che and all this rural guerrilla warfare. And then actually seeing what the Maoists in Nepal had done, I became very disillusioned by that method of bringing about social change. And I actually found out that they didn't overthrow the king. They had this weird thing called Jana Andolan II, or the People's Movement, where like the people just like took to the streets and took it over, and I had no conception of what that really meant. And then Tahrir Square happened, and it was just like, oh my God, I cannot believe that this is possible. So when it came to New York, I was really, really excited, because I think that tactically this is like the most pertinent question in today's society, how to create that type of movement and make it work. At Occupy Wall Street, I found out that doublespeak about democracy is not limited to our rulers who say that they're being democratic. when actually they're not. I found the overall mood amongst many people, particularly active in Occupy Wall Street, to be incredibly anti-democratic, very hostile to democracy, very hostile to one person, one vote, majority rules. It was always in the interest of protecting minorities like women and black and brown people who are actually not minorities. They're both majorities in the world. And I don't think that they need protection from the white men who are generally ruling Occupy Wall Street movement. Political possibilities, though, I think that it's going to happen again. Like, every single financial crisis that has ever happened in the history of this country has resulted in people doing massive demonstrations on Wall Street. Sometimes they take over the Brooklyn Bridge. This is not a new thing at all. There were Hoovervilles in Central Park after the Great Depression. They took over Central Park, which is pretty awesome. So this is going to come back. I think what it did was, it didn't make this thing possible. It clearly was possible already, but it did make it possible in the minds of this current generation. And I'm glad we got it out of the way, and the next generation is going to have to do it again. Hopefully we can do it again. And I think that right now we need to start organizing in more democratic, participatory, non-oppressive ways so that when it does come back, because it is going to come back, we're actually going to have something better to put in place of what we are trying to get rid of.
So first I'd kind of like to clarify that I think when discussing prefigurative politics, I'm not trying to indicate that I believe that it's possible to just create some space outside of capitalism. But I also don't believe that capitalism is maybe a totality. I think more what I'm trying to get at, so Ashanti Alston, this former Black Panther, when he talks about prefigurative politics, he uses this kind of interesting Christian metaphor from the Bible, where the early Christians thought of themselves as in this world, but not of it. So kind of like one foot in the world as it is in the empire that they were in, and one foot in this other world that was like kind of a becoming world. And I think that really is how we should think and orient ourselves in this struggle. Another way of looking at it is if you look at kind of like the only really successful revolutions that we kind of like have recorded in the recent past or in modernity is the ones that kind of like force this transition to capital or capitalism or bourgeois society in the nation state. And I think if we look at them just as like the French Revolution or the American Revolution, we're missing really the processes that made them possible, which was this long process of building the institutions that laid the foundation for bourgeois society. So this long process of kind of building banks and city-states and parliaments and all these different things that were the seeds that eventually erupted into this new world. And so I think the question is like, what does that look like? Like, what are the seeds that look like the world that we're trying to build, and what can we do to kind of like sow those seeds now? And then I think Occupy kind of forces, I don't know, so I think what we can learn from Occupy is that in a certain sense, all of our ideas about direct democracy and prefigurative politics are both right and wrong, if that makes sense. So when these different Occupies shot up all over the country, people immediately took to self-organizing, and like people didn't just kind of like sit around. Like people took on projects and did work and found ways to share the work and different things. So I feel like a lot of what I guess in the anarchist movement people have been developing over these years in small environments and small projects with this kind of like hope that like this would be the nucleus of someday a mass movement, actually in a certain way came true. And it was really interesting to me because being in Olympia during the port protests, we at the time really sincerely believed that we were kind of this vanguard that like was going to inspire this mass direct action movement all over the country, and that didn't happen. And part of it people kept telling us was that our ways of organizing were so culturally specific. We kept being told over and over again that you're never going to see a meeting of 100 people in the Midwest doing the twinkle fingers or trying to use consensus or anything like that. So to me, on the one hand, I think Occupy showed that like those of us kind of like grew up in the dark for 10 years trying to keep this project of direct democracy alive weren't crazy. But I think on the other hand, it showed that everything we knew about direct democracy and prefigure politics was also wrong, in the sense that these methods that we developed on like through like trying to run info shops and trying to coordinate direct action campaigns actually weren't expandable, and in many ways fell apart when we tried to apply them to this huge mass movement and how to run a camp and stuff like that. In this essay in the book We Are Many that Cindy Milstein wrote, I think she kind of sums up the predicament by saying that Occupy presented us with the humble experience of coming face to face with the chicken and egg question, the vegan version of course. Society and selves need to change before ourselves and society can change, yet we can only transform society and ourselves through the very process of trying to do so. And so I think in a certain way it just shows that like the process of changing society and building this new world is a lot messier than a lot of us thought when the project was a lot smaller than it was before 2011. And one more thing I want to put out there that I think we need to think through in light of Occupy is, I think in building movements, there's two different ways of relating to time. There's kind of like these moments that are like what I would call cycles of struggle, like parts of 2011, or before that 2009 with the student uprising, or before that like 1999 to 2001, where it seems like everything you do has these huge reverberations and like you're making history right now and like it's the moment. And then there's all of the rest of the time that we're alive, which hopefully is the slow grassroots capacity building work of actually building our capacity and building a movement. And I think what tends to happen is whenever we're in something that feels like it's the moment, like, you know, the fall of 2011, we drop all of the longer term work we were doing. And then when it no longer feels like it's the moment, we don't know how to return to this longer term grassroots like movement building work, and we get depressed and we like get nostalgic and we keep trying to do things that we think is going to reinvigorate Zuccotti Park or bring back Occupy or whatever. And if you look at history, that something very similar happened at the end of the 60s, and something very similar happened after 2001, and in smaller scales and projects that I've been involved with. So I think trying to think through how we relate our longer term capacity building, like movement building work with these moments where it feels like we're making history right now and like the whole world is watching us, I think is really key to figuring out how do we go from here. Because I think, sure, another eruption like Zuccotti Park is going to happen, but it's important to see what capacity we can build between then and now so it turns out differently.
Okay, thank you very much. You'd like to, yeah.
I'll try and be short because I think that I'm sure we'll cover a lot more of these things in the question and answer segment. I'm really glad you spoke about like the moment. That was kind of like what I was thinking but didn't know how to say, and also about the short, middle, and long-term goals. When I think about how Occupy and all of its offshoots have changed my political outlook, I'm 22, recently 22, so I'm pretty young. And I think I've always thought of myself as radical, just in terms of my personal politics and as much of what I could kind of get my hands on as a youth and as a young adult. And my father lost his job like 4 years ago, and that was like, being from an already kind of lower middle class family, that was like a really big thing for my family. And then getting into school, it was a full tuition like school, but still having student loans and kind of being on my own. I kind of feel like I experienced this kind of washing over of the city onto how I viewed myself, and I kind of had built this routine for myself where I was just kind of fending for myself, making sure I had work, making sure I was doing school, making sure I was supporting my family. And in a lot of that, the things that I viewed that made up the radical components of myself kind of got put on the back burner because this idea of the moment. And I was fortunate enough to have some professors that were a really big part of ACT UP and were able to work art into their like political work and their art work. And I remember thinking and like kind of being like, well, if only I had like a large social movement that I could ground my work in, I guess I'll just wait. And it was like this crazy moment where I was like, I guess I'm content waiting. And so this really for me was that kind of cliched waking up moment where I was like, wait a second, I don't want to be a part of this art world. I hate the art world. I don't like white box galleries. I'm in this school because I like art, not because I want to be an artist with a capital A. And so it really was that kind of near moment where I was like, wait a second. And I've been able to since kind of regather a lot of composure for myself and ground myself in that. So that's, I guess, my political outlook. As an activist and mass movements are concerned, I don't know if any of you have read the zine Anti-Mass. It's on, it's easily available if you look it up, but to this day, I'm not sure if I believe in mass movements, rather like mass mobilizations of lots of people that can get together that are made up of smaller movements that are like in agreement with each other. Because I just like, that's something that's always made sense to me, and I think even in Zuccotti, which was not the biggest of all encampments anyone's ever seen, that was really evident. There was like this kind of small group, and then there were the bigger groups and the bigger groups and the bigger groups, but there was really nothing that held those things together in a stable or long-term way. And I think I was able in those moments to like both be aware of the kind of chaos and humming of those large groups and how they were just happening, and also the fact that they were not happening because maybe we intended them to happen, just that they were happening. And so there's a lot of, for me, I've been able to reflect back on a lot of intention and what we thought was going to happen based on like the less than 20 people that were meeting in August, to the 200 people that were in the park, to the like 20,000 people that were out on big days, or the more that were out around the country. I do remember, as far as political possibilities, I do remember feeling some real kind of almost guilt for putting forth this model of like this camping in public space, which like for me felt so meaningful because we were doing it in this space which wasn't Wall Street, but was as close as we could get, and then all of these other cities adopting this model and taking it to parks because they felt like they had to be in parks even though maybe they were already socially working together in spaces that weren't parks, and then getting squashed by like the state. We had different hotlines and like emails that people could email us and ask us about these questions, and all across the board, and just like really like to this day I still feel like extremely guilty about. People would call and be like, we're having this problem, someone's stolen all the money. We're having this problem, there's like gangs with guns coming into the occupation. We're having this problem, people are being sexually assaulted, and they felt really alone because they couldn't tell. Oh.
Hi, I just want to, I'm
okay.
sorry to cut
That's
you
all
off,
right.
but I actually would really like to open
Sure.
it up for questions because...
That's okay.
Yeah.
As some of you might realize, we have food. We have dumplings in the meat and vegan variety. So maybe we could, if anyone wants to go get food, it's out there. So we could take like a 5-minute break before the Q&A.
Okay.
So after we like to open up the discussion, we'll have a microphone that'll go around. And again, so we have food out there. We have publications. We're the Platypus Affiliated Society. If you're interested or like to find out more, we have a sign-up sheet as well. For instance, about the upcoming event, which Ross mentioned. And yeah, so maybe 5 minutes, and then back here for the Q&A because we do have limited time.
Okay, back here at 8:25, please. Okay.
Taking a break now for refreshments and whatever.
Believe it or not, from Occupy Wall Street to Nepal, where I spent some time. And you can read my articles about Occupy Wall Street. If you Google Fritz Tucker, Occupy Wall Street will probably pop up.
Victoria?
I'm Victoria Campbell. I'm an artist. Nothing happens when you Google my name.
I'm David Hawk. Things happen when you Google my name. I guess in the thing that they put online, it says I'm part of Occupy Your Workplace, which is a working group of Occupy Wall Street. We try and organize unorganized workers. We're putting together a pamphlet like the Strike Debt one right now, which is a really great pamphlet. Yeah, I've written for Platypus and other stuff. And, yep.
I'll just use this one.
Okay. Oh, good idea.
My name is Victoria Sobel. I'm 22 and I'm also an artist. I'm currently a student at Cooper Union, so just like down the street, and I'm originally from Maryland. kind of in between DC and Baltimore. I'm currently still involved with Global Revolution. It's a media collective that's a global media collective. And not so many working groups, but if you live in Brooklyn and you're part of any sort of collective, talk to me afterwards. We're kind of making an assembly of collective groups that are, not, it doesn't have to be in Brooklyn. If you're not from Brooklyn, let's talk to you. If you're in any sort of collective.
Hi, my name's Sham Khanna. I'm an organizer with Strike Debt and a bike messenger. And over the past 10 years, I had previously been really involved with the kind of direct action wings of the anti-war and student movement.
Okay, thanks so much. And now we're going to take some questions from the audience. There's a microphone here. Okay, I think you're, well, okay. Great.
Hi guys. So I was kind of wondering if we could maybe hear a little bit more on your thoughts, kind of going off of the idea of Occupy as a people's movement. I wonder if you all would consider it a people's movement, and if so, I'm wondering to what extent we can think of a people, like can we think of an American people, or you know, who might be the people then instigating this movement or tactic, however you are considering it. And then furthermore, I'm wondering if what you think about the idea of Occupy as a populist movement, whether that would be useful or harmful or beneficial, and in what ways, I guess kind of just considering those things.
Who would like to answer that? Just indicate if you'd like to. Go ahead.
It's funny, I was just talking about that with my boyfriend earlier today, and as much as I would want to call it a people's movement, I think, and something that was slightly covered while we were doing the Q&A, was that as much as I might want to call Occupy a people's movement, there were a large number of peoples that were absent from the movement and could not be a part of the movement for all sorts of reasons, and that really the movement was, or the movement as it stands, is made up of people who are able to be a part of the movement, or who can come to the table. And if we have to put a name to those people, it's maybe people who can afford to be off work, or can afford to take off of school, or can risk arrest in certain things. And so in that way, it does go back to sort of different class and sort of standings. I wouldn't call it like a populist movement. I do think it should, and I hope would strive to continue towards the idea of a people's movement, and how to really reach, I'm not sure what that would mean, but how to really reach beyond what it's done so far.
So in my studies of people's movements around the world, I would definitely say that it was pretty typical people's movement. And it really helped me understand what a people's movement was. It's different from an organization. A movement is when many, many organizations come together for a common goal. I would say the common goal was combating the financial bourgeoisie, and they're throwing us all into crisis. I had something else to say, but I forgot for now. Sorry.
I want to say I'm skeptical of the idea of the people or a people's movement. I think that historically there's been this kind of like messy, intertangled web thing of the people and the nation state and modernity and this idea of like the majority. And I feel like kind of in thinking what our left in the 2012 should look like, I think maybe talking about the people isn't the best way to move forward.
Okay.
I agree. I'm equally skeptical of that term, and throughout the movement, I was interested in the premise of there being a 99%, how broad that was, and whether or not a people or even a class could be defined by just one's financial position. Like, I mean, especially in New York, where nobody's poor but everybody's broke. But what I do think it was a bunch of people who were you know, in a really specific demographic, like mostly white, mostly middle class, or mostly identified as middle class, and mostly young, and staring the future down the barrel and not really liking what it looked like. But I think it was an attempt to really find comrades and to find people who were in the same place as you were, in the hopes that in the hopes that some kind of intensity could be built from that.
Okay.
I guess like those are two separate questions. Like the part that it's about a people's movement and the part if it's a populist movement. I actually think I differ in the way that I do like populist discourse. I think it has its limits. Obviously, you know, I do know people who feel alienated from it because of those limits. You know, they feel like there's cisgender privilege and racial privilege and gender privilege in it. But what I think is great about Occupy is that it was able to take populist rhetoric while not losing those critiques within it, even though obviously I'm sure people had experiences where they felt like those critiques were lost within it. I also think that it was a certain demographic of the population who could come into the park. But I think that what made Occupy so successful is that populist rhetoric was so appealing to people everywhere. And I also think that there was a nice coming together of kind of anarchist, small-scale collectivist ideas with this like left populism. And I think they sort of complemented each other really well during the days of the park, at least, you know. And they were able, I think there was like different critiques coming together within it. So I actually like the populist discourse as a metaphor of people coming together, at least. As far as a people's movement, then we have to define like what a people is, which is sort of like a 17th, 16th, or maybe 17th century like concept, right, of this is what a people's is, right? So we got to decide, can we be a humanity as such, or are we just, you know, I don't know. But I do like, I know there's like severe criticisms of the populist rhetoric, but I think that so far it's done more good than it's done harm.
Okay. You want to add?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
So I just want to say that I think that the anarchists really set the stage. The people who started it set the stage, and they started this occupation. But it really only became a mass movement when large segments of our society started showing up. Around the third weekend, you had tens of thousands of people there, unions, all sorts of progressives. And I think this kind of movement, where it's very, very pluralistic, shows us where we are at as a society, all the different threads of political discourse that we have to deal with, and how hard it is to go from where we are at right now to the next step together. Because I do think that above all else, we do need to move on together. So I think the movement really brings all that to the forefront.
No, actually, front row. Yeah.
Hello. All right, so my question is hopefully a fun one, because I ask myself it all the time. If you could go to back to the first, like, say within the first 3 weeks, and give yourself a message or try to change one thing in the park, what would it be?
Would someone like to start with that? Victoria Sobel, do you want to? Are you raising your hand?
I wasn't, but
You were not.
I
You
could
don't
do
have
it. I could do it. I think like you, I came into the park with a really, really heavy skepticism. I was so negative about Occupy coming into it. The weeks prior to it, I like rode by Tompkins Square on my bike, and I was like looking at like the group meeting. I was like, it was bad. But what I saw in the first week, all right, here it is, Kevin, here it is. I would have told the person who had started the WePay in his name not to do that. And that's how finance and taking in online crowdsourcing became this massive question and responsibility, and that was something that I worked with very personally in the first month, and it was something that like was not on people's minds and then was the only thing people could talk about. So I would have told him the day I met him in the kitchen to close that and that we could just keep dumpstering food.
Okay, someone else? Anybody?
I guess if I could go back, I would try and I would tell myself to stop taking things so seriously and maybe attempt to start a coup, or at least like a radical extremist counter-revolution that just played freeze tag in the streets.
I would have shown up. It took me almost a month of like Occupy happening before I was even sure if I identified with it or not. And part of that is just like the years before Occupy, like being on the radical left was very, very depressing. Just kind of seemed like all of the projects that we had like tried really hard to build had fallen apart. And there was a time, especially in New York, and then also where I was mostly in the Northwest, where like a lot of radicals were like people hated each other so much. There was all these divisions that it was really hard to still want to be part of the movement. And especially when Occupy was starting, I was kind of like, it seemed to me almost like naive that in Egypt there was this decade of building capacity for Tahrir Square with the different networks that made that possible. And it seemed like we were kind of just like trying to replicate this tactic without looking at the context that happened in. And so I guess if I could have gone back, I would have told myself to not be so cynical. And I felt really jealous during the first like 6 months of Occupy of all these people that this was their first foray into the radical left, because they're so optimistic and so excited about everything. And I felt like even to this day, I'm still kind of like the person's like, calm down, you guys, it's gonna get really bad. Like, just because before Occupy, being on the left was like a really trying and depressing thing. And going through that over and over again, it gets really hard to get your hopes up.
Okay. Fritz.
So I would say that by far the #1 issue that I felt became more and more important every single day was having a democratic system in which the majority ruled. I think that the #1 impediment for getting things done and getting the right things done was the consensus method, or the modified consensus of having 90% of people have to agree on something. It's really not hard math, but if 90% of people have to agree on something to get done, that means 11% of people can stop things from getting done. And that is dictatorship of the minority, if you ask me. Democracy is the logical end to dialogue. Not everyone gets their way all the time, but things get done. It gets done together, which is very important. And I would say that I trust people. Most of the time, the right thing gets done. My workplace organized, and while this was all happening, and I was very adamant that we do a majority rules thing, we ended up doing that. The only 3 things we actually voted on, I was very adamant about my positions. I lost, my position lost all 3 of the votes, but I respected the democratic process, went along with it, and I later agreed that it was actually the right thing to do. I was not in the right. The majority was in the right.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything to say about this question, or should we take? I think we're ready for another question. And yeah, which.
I would just like to ask how destructive to the movement overall, because I mean you've made it clear what your stance on that is, the horizontal organization of it all, and the general assembly. How destructive would you say that was to the movement overall? I think it's quite destructive.
How destructive was it? I mean, it would be really hard to measure that. I think that there are, you know, I think that there's, you know, there are many pitfalls in having a democratic system based on the majority, or dominated by the majority, because it doesn't necessarily mean that the majority is going to get to decide or that the majority has power. What that means is that the individuals or ideologies or whatever force that can communicate to the majority the best is the one in power. When it comes down to it, I don't think that the system that Occupy Wall Street had in place really allowed for any kind of effective critical discourse. I don't think it allowed, like what it did basically was that there was a general fear of all kinds of hierarchy, even experience, and so that meant that there weren't like experts dominating, but that also meant that one's individual experience and knowledge wasn't considered unless it was shared by everybody else. So that puts the majority at kind of like a lowest common denominator when it comes to addressing problems. And the systems of communication, I think, also contributed to this kind of breaking apart. Like, when it comes down to it, like, the human microphone can be a powerful thing. It was very effective in the first few days, but it doesn't allow for more, like, basically you're speaking in, like, Twitter language. Like, you can't say very much. You can't discuss it. The General Assembly allowed a lot of space for deliberation, but it didn't allow space for arguments. And I think that that arguments could have been, would probably have been very productive. The General Assemblies got so long that people got bored. They didn't care about their positions so much. And so I think that, yeah, I think that the dictatorship of the majority did contribute to this destruction. I don't know how fast or at what point it did, or how you could, yeah, like I think the ways in which it did are very specific and not inherent to this process, but certainly come along with it.
David, did you?
Yeah. Actually wrote something called The Future Belongs to the Process Fetishists that was never published. And it was kind of about, I believe that democracy doesn't connotate one thing. It doesn't connotate majoritarian democracy, Democracy to me is an experimental process where we try and find a system that has the greatest amount of representation to the greatest amount of people. So in that way, like, the horizontal process to me is a form of democracy, if not majoritarian democracy, and then we can get into a discussion about anarchism, but I'm not going to right now. So I think actually the horizontal process worked, and it worked in the way that it didn't work exactly the way that it was supposed to work, and I'll explain this. I think that if it was like a direct method of voting where stuff could run through and you could get results really quickly, then like we would have the chance of ending up with like the Ron Paul amendment to something, I thought for the situation, the fact that it was like a slow process that took a long time, it took work. It was called consensus building because you built it up, was a good thing. And I was sort of surprised when the first communication of Wall Street came out, the one that was like read on the air, that I agreed with it so much. I forget what that was called exactly. But so I think that in a way the horizontal process worked for the movement. It did kind of bring out sort of there's an element within democracy which is meritocratic, which is you have to show up, right? That's what democracy is. You have to show up somewhere. So since the horizontal process kind of heightened that, and people who showed up more, had more of a say in it. So I mean, I think there are serious problems with it. For certain situations, I think it would be awful. For certain situations, there'd be other forms of democracy that would be better, or other processes that would be better. I think when May 1st planning was coming, the Spokes Council and the General Assembly were completely dissolved during that time. And I think it would have been great to see like some kind of new process come out that was going forward. And people tried to plan that in the summer, and nothing came. And then we had the second September 17th, which brought the movement back. So I think it doesn't really matter what kind of process it is exactly, as long as it's bringing different people together with different ideas. Like I thought what was great about May 1st was anti-authoritarian and anarchist and labor union people coming together.
David, thanks. I'm gonna hand the microphone to Fritz here because we have another question over here, and I have a quick question. There's someone in the back as well. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to be real quick. Everything I'm saying is in much more detail in my articles, but to be very, very specific of how destructive the process was. So on day 2, during the first General Assembly in Zuccotti Park, one of the main things became whether or not we should march on Wall Street. This was at a time when people did not know how hostile or how not hostile the cops were to us. The leaders were like, we must have unity above all else, and leading us in these chants with the human microphone. When it became clear that their position that we should not march on Wall Street became the dominant position, they had a vote. They lost the vote, but right before they were going to lose the vote, they were like, just so everybody knows, we are all autonomous individuals and we can do whatever we want. So much for unity. On the other hand, when the General Assembly became totally bureaucratized and just was totally falling apart, they came up with the Spokes Council. It was less participatory and less democratic. In order to push through the idea of the Spokes Council, which was not popular, it lost 4 votes before it finally got pushed through. During the final vote, they led chants and songs about how much unity we needed, even though the plan that they were doing was to break down the unity into the Spokes Council, which was not unified. So instead of amending the General Assembly so that it did promote unity, they got rid of it while saying this is the most democratic thing we could possibly think of.
Okay. Thank you. You have a question. Wait for the microphone.
So what do you all think is one of the next big points of struggle for the left? How has Occupy possibly laid the groundwork for that struggle, and in what ways has it not laid the groundwork, and might we have to reinvent things?
Sean, you were looking at me. Do you want to say something about that?
I think that right now, so early in the panel, people talked a couple times about there being the inevitability of another kind of big rupture like Zuccotti Park, and I think one thing that seems looming is that the student debt crisis, it seems pretty apparent to me, in the next couple of years is going to cause some type of much deepening of the crisis that we're in right now, because the bubble is over $1 trillion, and I think it's inevitable that it's going to collapse. And so I think doing some work now to prepare structures that are expandable in the ways that maybe some of the Occupy structures weren't, that can contain what potentially could be a very large and potentially very powerful anti-capitalist movement, I think is some important work to happen now that is beginning to happen through strike debt. And I think part of that, what that looks like is, I feel like in the past, so I feel like part of it is figuring out what organizing around debt looks like, and like how do we create the debtor as like a political subject. And we're starting to do that through organizing like debt assemblies where people come together and talk about how debt's been affecting them. And I think through that we're kind of developing this analysis of debt and like what it means to act collectively against debt. So I think that's one avenue kind of coming out of Occupy Wall Street. But I think there's also a whole many avenues.
Okay. So anybody else have a response to that particular question?
Okay. I'm not sure if Occupy Wall Street offered any real progress in terms of the left in a way that was different from movements before it. It might have offered some insight as to what it means for the left in the present moment. But I think that as it goes on, then hopefully these kinds of movements can become more critical of democratic structures and question the democracy that is handed down to us. And I think a lot of progress will happen on the left when the institutions of the left have been dismantled. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a quick question. I know there's also someone in the back. This is okay. I'll just say this quickly. I want to. This is partly just following up on something that was touched on in a number of comments by Sham and some others. I'm particularly thinking of where Sham cited Shanti saying that we need to be in this world but not of it, and there was that in some ways capitalism was a totality and in some ways it was not. I'm wondering if capitalism is not in some sense a totality, how would it be not a totality if in fact the financial collapse, especially the collapse of Bear Stearns, affected every corner of the world? I mean, in what sense is it not a totality? That's really the question. Okay, I mean, is it, for you, but also for the other panelists?
Does anyone else want to answer first? Or should...
I feel like you just second.
Okay, so I feel like, so that's a complicated question, but I feel like in certain ways, on the one hand, there's all of this type of reproductive labor that has and hasn't been recuperated by capital. And then I think another way, a useful way of looking at it is in David Graeber's book about debt, he talks about this idea of what he calls baseline communism, which is these kind of like these very basic ways in which people cooperate and share that makes any type of sociality possible, and kind of argues that that creates the basis out of which like capital is possible, so that even within this kind of totalizing system, there has to be some things that aren't based on exploitation and domination for the exploitation and domination to happen. Another way of looking at it is that in Commonwealth, one of Hart and Negri's more recent books, they talk about this idea that increasingly capitalist production is based on this idea of the common, that there's certain things that are held in common that on the one hand, the types of new informationalized production that happens needs, so things like computer codes, right? Like for certain types of production to happen, everyone needs to have access to these kinds of languages and codes. But on the other hand, for it to be profitable, they need to kind of minimalize access to that. So I feel like in a certain way, this kind of like baseline communism or this idea of the common is one of the major kind of contradictions within capital, that like capital needs something beyond capital for it to survive, but also for it to expand, it needs to also destroy the thing that it needs.
Would anybody else like to answer that question?
Go ahead.
You can.
I think capitalism is just a generalized social relationship, and that if we can somehow come to a point where we have a different social organization, then capitalism, then that relationship will be different. I think that that a change in these relationships could happen. I think that there's the greatest possibility at, not necessarily at the level of the local, but at the level of the intimate. But that would be a very grand restructuring of our understanding of our relationship to society.
Well, I agree with Marx that it is a totalizing system, whereas, you know, all previous modes of production get drawn into capitalism. It's part of its nature of how it developed. It's even Marx has a concept, he calls it a partial totality, I think. You know, I think in the rich West, you can successfully completely drop out of capitalism if you want to. I'm not, you know, saying that's a good or bad form of struggle. It's just possible. And there are still some corners that capitalism hasn't touched. And it's a way of, I think, as a way of looking at it, as a way of social, political, economic struggle, perhaps not economic, but it can be helpful to look at it not as a totality. So I think in the ways that it's not a totality, I don't know if I completely agree that it's parasitic upon other social relations, which is kind of what David Graeber thinks. But I mean, there are other ways to avoid its influence, I guess.
I know. Okay, I think. Pat, were you? I think you were raising a hand from the back row over there before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Microphone to Pat.
Okay.
I think that one thing that happens in these conversations about Occupy is that all of a sudden there's a concentration on democracy. Like we go down the route in which we talk about like processes of exchange and communication and networks and committees and spoke councils, and they all seem to reflect an attempt at least to have an idea about what democracy could look like. So in a sense, like the answer to one of the questions is that the form of anti-capitalism that Occupy had was a stance that capitalism was somehow inherently anti-democratic, and thus the movement should create opportunities for the articulation of democracy, whatever that could mean. And thus there was experimentation, there was failure, there were different attempts, but nonetheless, I think at the heart of the main comments that were said here, there was this sort of imagination that democracy could be created in these spaces, in these new social relations. So I guess that goes back to something that was, you know, recently said. I mean, someone brought in Graeber, and which is the relationship between capitalism and democracy, like, and how we conceive of like either like historically it's sort of coming into being. Did democracy actually require capitalism in order to open up spaces of civil society? And what's the relationship of it today? I think that I wonder, I guess, in a kind of second remove, why those questions were not really at the forefront of the conversations that were happening in Occupy, even though they seem so central. Meaning, like, I don't know if I have like an answer right now. I think that this is an interesting conversation to, you know, have a discussion about what kind of politics respond to the contradictory character of democracy within capitalism. But it is perhaps sort of surprising or maybe revelatory of a problem that within a movement in which this seems so central, those types of conversations were not happening. I think that the closest part of it, I remember, well, there was all this discussion about the gift economy that happened during the May 1st. I remember the planning meetings and these kind of things. But it just seems such a central issue that there should have been arguments, right? Discussions back and forth, sort of arguments presented as to what one thinks. But there weren't really any. So I just wonder why it was missing.
One thing that I learned at Zuccotti is that a festival is not the best place to talk about democracy. I think that Occupy Wall Street, it became a spectacle. I think that the people who were leading it from the beginning wanted it to be a spectacle because they wanted to get on television. It became one, and then you had tourists showing up to see what was going on. They weren't interested in partaking in a democratic process. They just wanted to watch. They just wanted to be the viewers of the spectacle. So I think that is one reason why, as a dominant part of the discourse, it never happened. I will say, though, that I made it a point, I would go down there on Saturdays because I work during the week. I made it a point of just going up to people and talking to them about the democratic process and where they would like to see it go. Whenever I said anything at the General Assembly, I always pushed that point. However, after about a month, it became impossible to even speak at General Assemblies. You had to go to like 3 different meetings first and then get put on the agenda. So the democratic nature of it quickly got suppressed. And I think that it's times like these where we are more apt to talk about democracy. I think in our everyday lives we have to talk more about democracy. The festival atmosphere was not particularly conducive.
I think I'm going to have to disagree with you in that it was a festival atmosphere. I mean, it was certainly a spectacle atmosphere, but the park and the movement from the very beginning was organized around labor, around the same systems of production as in like an office environment, albeit a very horizontal one, but still, like, you know, you had working groups. Affinity groups weren't given a lot of power, and it also found its form through solutions. So that meant that long-term things like having these conversations weren't as important as breaking it up, breaking the goals of the movement into small tasks. And there were also time and space limitations. There literally wasn't a space for these conversations to be had, and they were being had, but there wasn't a space for them to enter into the decision making. There just wasn't that structure.
I kind of want to echo what you just said, in that my memories of the month of September were that actually that conversation was very present, but that there weren't as many people, and that conversation didn't play into the structure that was being used for that smaller number. And then once the park kind of exploded, that structure was held, and then those conversations were pushed to the background, and really what stayed in the forefront were the kind of infrastructural, how to keep moving, how to keep going, and anything that was kind of more long-term or conceptual was kind of relegated to, like, have your conversation, you're a working group, but you probably won't be heard. From what I do know about the domestic occupies and also the other global movements, is that actually in their encampments and in their movements, it actually is a much bigger part of the conversation. Many of them did model their encampments and parks after us, but I think that what they were bringing to the table was something like really, really different. I didn't get to go to too many, but I was in touch with a lot of people, and they were coming up with like actually a lot of really great alternatives that were possible in their communities, which were smaller or different than ours, which was not a pre-existing community, but rather like a kind of weird convergence of a bunch of people that didn't know each other. So Occupy, as it took place in smaller communities and cities and states, was actually really different, because these were people who lived with each other. And aside from like Oakland and some of the other big ones, the occupies were made up of people that already knew each other and were going to keep living with each other. So the conversation was really different for them.
I'm gonna, Ross?
I think it was interesting when we were talking, when the question was, is this a people's movement, was posed. The question was really on the people, you know, is this a people's movement? The second aspect of that, you know, really was kind of taken for granted. I think, especially today, and especially in the absence of any sort of clear unified goal, one has to ask the question of what a movement, a social movement is. 'Cause, I mean, historically, the idea of a movement really only emerged in the 19th century. Theoreticians like Lawrence von Stein wrote about the social movement in France. I mean, but the concept was that there was a sort of definite goal towards which a large mass of people, a large group of people were moving. It was that goal, in fact, that allowed them to gauge how far they had come in relation to it. That was how they measured, where the movement had come, where it had been, and where it was going. And even after the defeat of movements that wanted to abolish capital, that wanted to end wage labor, there were still movements like women's suffrage, civil rights, and so on, each of which had, definitive goals like, achieving universal
change the tape.
Male and female suffrage,